Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, May 29th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article today, prices in the U.S. are rising at the fastest pace in years. Officials at the central bank have embraced the possibility of higher interest rates to get resurgent inflation under control, by Colby Smith. A measure of inflation closely watched by the Federal Reserve accelerated in April to a 3-year high, reinforcing the central bank's budding support to consider raising interest rates if price pressures do not ease. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index rose 3.8% from the same time last year. It was the fastest annual pace since May 2023, when the Fed was in the midst of raising rates to tame a burst of inflation that had emerged in the wake of the pandemic. A measure of underlying inflation that strips out volatile food and energy prices also notched a multi-year high. That measure, core inflation, increased at an annual pace of 3.3%, the fastest since November 2023. On a monthly basis, inflation rose slightly less than expected. Overall prices jumped 0.4%, and those excluding food and energy prices ticked up 0.2%. That was a welcome reprieve, but on the whole, the latest data, which the Commerce Department released on Thursday, underscored the difficult position that officials at the central bank are now in, with price pressures intensifying because of the war with Iran. This month, the Consumer Price Index, another inflation gauge, also showed that consumer prices had risen at the fastest pace since May 2023. Consumers have started to moderate their spending in the face of resurgent prices, according to Thursday's data. Spending, once adjusted for inflation, rose just 0.1% in April as incomes flatlined and the savings rate dropped to the lowest level since June 2022. The Commerce Department also revised lower its assessment of growth in the first quarter, noting that the economy expanded 1.6% on an inflation-adjusted basis compared with its initial estimate of 2%. The war, which began in late February, has severely disrupted global energy markets, raising the urgency of a deal between President Trump and Iranian officials. No agreement has emerged, however, and renewed hostilities in recent days have dimmed hopes that a crucial shipping pathway, the Strait of Hormuz, will be reopened soon. The Fed typically ignores or looks through supply shocks because they historically tend to affect prices only temporarily. John C. Williams, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, appeared to back this approach in remarks on Thursday. He acknowledged that continuing supply chain disruptions caused by the war were worrisome, but he estimated that the impact on inflation could peak in a few months. But other officials have begun to question whether the look-through approach is the right one, given that the war with Iran is the fourth shock in 5 years to push inflation further from the Fed's 2% target. The U.S. economy has weathered a series of events that have raised prices during the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Mr. Trump's global trade war. Since 2021, inflation has been higher than the central bank would like. Expectations about inflation in the next 5 or 10 years still reflect confidence that the central bank will eventually succeed in bringing inflation down to 2%. But the longer inflation stays above that target, the more likely that confidence could begin to ebb. With the labor market on firmer footing than just a couple of months ago, more Fed officials have embraced the possibility that rates may need to rise to get inflation fully under control. I want to be clear about my risk assessment. The risks remain tilted toward higher inflation, said Lisa D. Cook, a Fed governor, in remarks on Wednesday. I am prepared to raise rates if the expected disinflation does not appear in a timely manner. That followed a speech last week by Christopher J. Waller, another governor, who made clear that he could no longer rule out rate hikes further down the road if inflation does not abate soon. That, he added, was especially true if measures of inflation expectations, some of which have risen lately, show signs of becoming unanchored. The specter of higher rates comes amid a leadership transition at the Fed. Kevin M. Warsh, whom Mr. Trump picked to replace Jerome H. Powell as chair, was sworn in to the top job at the Fed last week. Mr. Trump has long berated the Fed for not lowering rates quickly enough. Mr. Trump has hinted he will try to ease up on his pressure campaign now that Mr. Warsh is at the helm. At Friday's swearing-in ceremony, which was held at the White House for the first time since 1987, the president said he wanted Mr. Warsh to be totally independent. But that leeway could quickly disappear, especially if the Fed begins to more seriously consider rate increases, which would make all types of borrowing more expensive. Traders in federal funds futures markets expect the central bank to eventually raise rates early next year. Judge declines, for now, to block mail-in voting changes ordered by Trump. The ruling allowed the Trump administration to continue to pursue changes that include enlisting the Postal Service in checking voters against a national database. By Zach Montague and Adam Sella. A federal judge on Thursday declined, for the moment, to block an executive order President Trump signed in March targeting mail-in voting and directing the creation of a federal database of citizens to help guide states on voter eligibility. The decision allows the Trump administration to continue pursuing measures to insert the federal government into the administration of elections that are otherwise managed by the states. The administration has proposed changes at the Postal Service and having the Homeland Security Department compile state-by-state voter lists using Social Security data and other information drawn from federal databases. In a 26-page opinion, Judge Carl J. Nichols wrote that it was premature for the court to intervene. He wrote that the Trump administration had yet to carry out much of the order, leaving most of the harms predicted by the lawsuit still hypothetical. He added that if evidence emerged that the changes were burdening state officials or sowing confusion, the Democratic-aligned groups who have sued to block the order could return to court. The court recognizes that the Postal Service may ultimately issue a final rule that directly affects plaintiffs or their members, or that the government may develop state citizenship lists that omit specific individuals due to particularized flaws, he wrote. Plaintiffs may, of course, renew their motions if and when those future actions occur. The ruling came as the Trump administration has moved aggressively since last year to compile voter roll data at the national level over the objections of state officials and voting rights organizations. Several federal judges have struck down efforts by the administration to request voter information from the states. A group of Democratic organizations and lawmakers had sued to stop the executive order, arguing that it was a violation of federal privacy law to compile a centralized database of eligible voters, and also unlawful interference in state elections to circulate that data among local officials. The case combined 3 separate lawsuits brought by groups including the NAACP, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and included Senator Chuck Schumer and Representative Hakeem Jeffries, the Senate and House minority leaders. Mail-in voting is safe and secure, a hallmark of our free and fair elections, Mr. Schumer said in a statement. Trump's order is not about election integrity. It is voter suppression, plain and simple. During a hearing in May, lawyers representing the Democratic groups told Judge Nichols, a Trump appointee, that the risks of abuse were significant. They painted a dark picture of the coming election season, arguing that the Trump administration appeared intent on injecting chaos into the system and empowering low-level officials to act on the administration's behalf in policing elections. The groups emphasized that the federal voter list, if created, would most likely be prone to outdated or faulty data, and warned that local officials could use the list to improperly disenfranchise legal voters. They also warned that the order would direct the Postal Service to work outside its legal mandate, forcing it into a new role monitoring voting. In court, the Justice Department appeared to partially acknowledge those concerns, telling Judge Nichols the lists were seen more as reference material for state election boards and acknowledging they would not be an exhaustive or up-to-date registry of valid voters. Stephen M. Pezzi, a Justice Department lawyer, said the government was still working to evaluate the order and had not started gathering the data it envisioned. Mr. Pezzi agreed to a request from Judge Nichols to inform the court if the government began taking steps to assemble the lists. But Todd Blanche, the acting Attorney General, appeared to contradict that position during Senate testimony in May, indicating the Justice Department was actively working with the White House to carry out the order. Asked about Mr. Blanche's testimony and the government's progress, a spokesman for the Department of Justice said, "The department has statutory authority to enforce our nation's election laws, including through requesting state voter rolls to screen them for ineligible entries. It's working with other agencies within the administration to implement the goals," he said. "I think they are appropriate goals to make sure we have free and fair elections, to make sure that those are implemented, whether it's the DOJ that needs to implement them or some other federal agency." In the order on Thursday, Judge Nichols appeared inclined to give the administration the benefit of the doubt until there were more concrete details about the lists. He wrote that it remained to be seen what state election officials might use them for, but that it was not clear the federal government's compiling them was inherently unlawful. The order does not mandate any action by a state once a list has been transmitted to it, and in any event, no infrastructure for compilation or transmission of the lists has been established. No list has been created or transmitted, and no state has taken any action with respect to any list, he wrote. When Mr. Trump signed the executive order in March, he mused that the order could face legal challenges, but said he thought it was foolproof. "You may have to find a rogue judge," he said, while showing the signed order to journalists. "That's the only way that can be changed." The order requires the Postal Service to take its first steps to complying by May 30th, issuing notice by that day of a rulemaking process to adopt the changes. Mr. Trump has also called on the Postal Service to deliver only ballots of voters deemed eligible. Postal and election experts denounced that as an illegal overstep of presidential authority. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. ICE restrictions, a new tax. What's in New York's $269 billion budget? Governor Kathy Hochul used the state budget as a vehicle for policy initiatives, including a new second home tax and a push to make the state less hospitable to immigration agents. By Grace Ashford. Nearly 2 months past deadline, New York finally has a state budget. Lawmakers cast the final votes to pass a roughly $269 billion state budget late Wednesday night, the latest approval in nearly 2 decades. Passage was delayed by a variety of contentious policy issues. Many of those were priorities of Governor Kathy Hochul, a Democrat who is running for re-election this fall. In the last budget of her first full term, she successfully pushed to reform auto insurance, streamline state-level environmental reviews, and delay mandated climate goals. Yet the lateness of the budget frustrated many in the legislature, who will now have just 1 week to try to pass their priorities before the 2026 session is scheduled to end. Even so, the budget does include things pushed by the legislature, including a sweeter pension deal for police personnel, teachers, and firefighters. There are also new taxes on multi-million-dollar second homes in New York City and nicotine pouches. Here are 6 key things to know about the budget and why it's about a lot more than money. New York shirks its climate leader status. New York is not on track to achieve the goals laid out in the ambitious 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The budget offers 2 means of addressing that. One way is a fresh $1 billion allocation to develop renewables. The other, insisted upon by Ms. Hochul, rewrites the fine print to make the goals easier to reach. Because some of the climate goals may drive up consumer costs, the governor may be betting that voters may be more concerned about their own finances than fossil fuels come November. But many lawmakers and environmentalists say that weakening climate goals backtracks on Democratic promises and runs counter to environmental justice imperatives. Assemblywoman Jessica Gonzalez Rojas, a Democrat, spoke for many when she voted in favor of the budget while castigating the changes to the climate law. "I do not support weakening our commitment to confronting the climate crisis," she said, describing the choice between affordability and climate justice as a false choice. Republicans said the legislature should have done more to weaken the law, which they said leaves a major burden on industry and consumers. Teachers, police, and firefighters benefit. In 2012, when Andrew M. Cuomo was governor, he negotiated a deal to reduce pension benefits for teachers, the police, and firefighters that he said would save the state $80 billion over the next 3 decades. The state created a 6th tier for newly hired teachers and other public employees who would receive less generous retirement benefits than their longer-tenured colleagues. Ever since, labor unions have been pushing Albany to fix Tier 6 by improving its benefits, which they say would help recruiting and talent retention. Albany relented this year. The president of the State Teachers Union, Melinda Person, praised the agreement, which will improve benefits and allow teachers to retire at 58 rather than 63. This Tier 6 agreement is proof that when workers organize and stay united, change is possible. This is a victory for public workers across New York, she said. But many lawmakers expressed concern about the roughly $550 million yearly cost to state and local governments. The mother of all pension sweeteners will leave a sour taste in the mouth of taxpayers, Assemblyman Michael Fitzpatrick, a Republican representing Suffolk County, said, suggesting that the change was a giveaway to the labor interests that supported lawmakers. "We'll vote against the taxpayers' interests before we vote against our own," he said with a sigh. Taxing the rich and bailing out Mamdani. The governor was adamantly opposed to raising taxes, but New York City faced a multi-billion-dollar budget gap, and its new mayor, Zohran Mamdani, repeatedly appealed to Albany for help, preferably by taxing the rich. The mayor was ultimately successful, winning nearly $8 billion in state assistance over the next 2 years, as well as a new tax on high-end second homes in New York City that the Senate has said will bring in $506 million annually. The tax will be instituted in 2 phases. Initially, second homes with a so-called market value of $1 million or more will face a tax surcharge between 4% and 6.5%. But New York City's definition of market value often vastly understates a home's true worth. One midtown penthouse with a market value of $4.2 million recently sold for $135 million. The city will eventually set up a new valuation system based on the sales price of condos and co-ops, with tax rates ranging from 0.8% for units valued between $5 to $15 million and 1.3% for homes worth $25 million or more. Mr. Mamdani also won state approval to delay existing pension payments, a short-term play that will eventually cost the city billions of dollars over the next decade. New restrictions on ICE in New York. State lawmakers passed a long-awaited package aimed at curtailing abuses by immigration agents. The legislation would bar agents from wearing masks, require judicial warrants to search schools, hospitals, and churches, and end agreements that allowed for resource sharing between local law enforcement and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Some immigration advocates have raised concerns that the legislation does nothing to address more informal communication between the police and ICE agents that can be the basis for many deportations. The legislation also would allow New Yorkers to sue ICE agents in state and federal court if they believe their constitutional rights have been violated, a measure that, like the mask ban, is expected to end up in court. Hochul versus trial lawyers. For years, the trial lawyers' lobby wielded tremendous influence in Albany, particularly when Speaker Sheldon Silver, a lawyer himself, was serving in the Assembly. The reforms included in this year's budget, aggressively opposed by the trial lawyers, mark a clear diminution of that influence. Under the changes, people found to be more than 50% responsible for causing a crash will not be eligible for pain and suffering damages. The definition of serious injury was also made narrower, a change that Ms. Hochul said will help prevent fraudulent staged accidents. Ms. Hochul proposed the changes with a goal of lowering the state's sky-high auto insurance rates, but the idea was met with great skepticism by enough Democratic lawmakers that they were able to add bill language to ensure that savings were not merely pocketed by insurance companies. The fight quickly became ugly as the lawyers' lobby repeatedly accused the governor of acting on behalf of Uber, which backed the changes. Also tucked into the many thousands of pages that make up the budget, just in time for the November election, some taxpayers will receive rebate checks between $100 and $200, depending on income, intended to cover some of the costs of rising utility bills. Checks will be issued to single taxpayers earning up to $150,000 and joint filers up to $300,000. There will be a new tax on alternative nicotine products that will raise the price of Zyn, a nicotine pouch. People who have received 16 speeding tickets in a one-year period will be required to install a speed limiting device on their car or lose their registration. A much-heralded commission to study reparations for the descendants of enslaved people has been delayed. There are new protections for children online. The state streamlined its environmental review process so as to speed the construction of new housing on previously disturbed land. A controversial measure aimed at protecting worshipers has passed. The legislation sets up a 50-foot perimeter around temples, churches, and community centers. Similar legislation passed in New York City over the opposition of Mr. Mamdani. Free speech groups have said they had grave concerns about the effects of the measure on speech. Although the 50-foot buffer was included in a larger omnibus bill, many lawmakers still spoke up on the floor, describing it as a way to push back against anti-Semitism. This legislation isn't about Israel, said Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz, a Democrat from the Bronx, explaining his support for the measure, but it is in a certain way. Quarantine unit for Americans exposed to Ebola to open in Kenya Friday. But U.S. officials are still working to find centers in Europe to accept Americans who need advanced treatment, seen as critical to improving odds of survival. By Karun Demirjian and Apurva Mandavili. A 50-bed quarantine unit that the United States is setting up in Kenya to house American citizens exposed to the Ebola virus will be operational on Friday, according to senior administration officials, but it is unclear where the administration plans to send those who test positive or become ill for extended treatment. The facility, located at a Kenya Air Force base in Laikipia, is a joint effort between the U.S. Departments of State, Defense, and Health and Human Services. It will be staffed by officers from the commissioned corps of the U.S. Public Health Service, the senior officials told reporters in a press call on Thursday. The team will include staff who were part of the U.S. response to the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, the largest ever recorded. It will also include a number of isolation and biocontaminant units to hold those who fall ill and transport them to more specialized facilities, though the officials did not say when those units would be operational. But the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the State Department are still working to identify facilities in Europe to accept Americans who need advanced treatment for Ebola, seen as critical to improving odds of survival. The Trump administration has ruled out transporting them back to the United States. The Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo is already estimated to have caused more than 1,000 cases and more than 200 deaths since it was announced May 15th. Public health experts have warned that the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development last year has crippled the surveillance systems and healthcare infrastructure that are crucial for snuffing out outbreaks. In prior outbreaks, healthcare workers and other U.S. citizens exposed to the virus were brought home to be treated at specialized medical units. President Trump made his views clear at the time, posting on social media in August in 2014 that the U.S. cannot allow Ebola-infected people back. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio echoed that sentiment, saying we cannot and will not allow any cases of Ebola to enter the United States. On Thursday, senior administration officials argued the decision not to transport American patients back to the United States was driven by a desire to more quickly move patients to facilities where they can get more comprehensive care. They did not explain why those who do not yet have symptoms would be better off quarantining in Kenya for 3 weeks, the incubation period for Ebola. So far during this outbreak, the administration has moved one American physician who became ill with Ebola to Germany, where he has been receiving treatment with monoclonal antibodies. The administration also sent another American physician to the Czech Republic for monitoring. Senior administration officials said patients who test positive for Ebola will be able to begin receiving monoclonal antibodies to treat the virus while at the facility in Kenya, though it was not clear when that treatment or the units to house such patients would be available. What they are trying to stand up in Kenya cannot and will not be comparable to the treatment they would get in the U.S., said Dr. Fiona Havers, an infectious disease physician who resigned from the CDC last year. Last week, the Trump administration invoked a public health law known as Title 42 to bar immigrants and legal permanent residents who had been in Congo, Uganda, or South Sudan in the previous 21 days from entering the United States. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Carney says Canada's distancing from the U.S. is good for America. Speaking in New York, the Canadian Prime Minister called for a new relationship between Canada and the United States. By Ian Austin. Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada said on Thursday that his country's attempt to reduce its diplomatic and economic dependency on the United States because of President Trump will also benefit Americans. This is good for all Canadians, but it is also good for the United States because a stronger Canada is a better ally, Mr. Carney said in a speech at the Economic Club of New York. We know that when Canada and the United States have had our differences over the centuries, we have always worked and eventually worked through them because we share values and common interests run deep. Mixing Mr. Trump's campaign slogan with his own catchphrase, Mr. Carney added, "Let's be absolutely clear. Canada strong will help make America great again." But Mr. Carney did not downplay the global turmoil brought by the Trump administration, changes that he first pointed out earlier this year at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in a speech that attracted worldwide attention. "The world is undergoing a rupture," he said. "Led by the United States, technological change is accelerating at a pace we have not seen in our lifetime. The U.S. is transforming all its commercial relationships, as is its right. The world is becoming more divided and dangerous. Canada," he said, "has responded quickly to these shifts by diversifying our partnerships abroad. We have to care ourselves and be true to ourselves," he said. The Prime Minister also directly criticized the tariffs Mr. Trump has imposed on Canada's steel, aluminum, and automaking industries. Many analysts fear that tariffs threaten the survival of companies in those sectors and may even ultimately doom automaking in Canada. "A return to the tariff-free trade in autos," Mr. Carney said, "is the best and most durable way to confront intense global competition." He also reminded the audience of Canada's role as the largest supplier of imported oil, natural gas, and electricity and potash, as well as shipments of other important materials like nickel, copper, and uranium. He lavished praise on the United States, even as he took aim at President Trump's policies. Mr. Carney said that the United States is approaching its 250th anniversary as the most dynamic, resilient, and inventive country the world has ever seen, as a country whose founding values of liberty, justice, democracy, and openness should continue to serve as guides to its future and that of the world, Mr. Carney said. That future should include a new partnership with Canada, a true partnership that reimagines cooperation in specific sectors deeply challenged by global competition. Mr. Carney, who was once the central banker of Canada and England and a senior investment executive, was with familiar faces on Thursday. Aside from his speech, the Prime Minister spent the day meeting with large investors in New York as part of his campaign to attract $1 trillion in investments to Canada over 5 years. When he moved into politics last year, Mr. Carney was vice chairman of Brookfield Asset Management, a New York headquartered unit of Toronto-based Brookfield that currently manages about $1 trillion in assets. He was also chairman of Bloomberg, the financial and news service founded by Michael R. Bloomberg, former mayor of New York. Courting American investors might seem out of tune with Mr. Carney's growing reputation as the leader who famously called on the world's middle powers in Davos to band together in a world changed by Mr. Trump. But earlier this month in Toronto, he also opened up the possibility that Canada might agree to join in with some of the Trump administration's trade protectionism if that will save free trade provisions of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is now up for review. Canada remains open to deeper integration, including options for Fortress North America in selected sectors, he told a meeting of progressive politicians. And to be clear, those offers are on the table. Laurie Turnbull, a political scientist at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, said that opening reflects the impossibility for Canada of fully or even substantially replacing the United States as a trade and economic partner. Canada is going to have to find a way to deal with this, and the Americans are still going to put on the tariffs, Professor Turnbull said. We're in a weak position, and they can call the shots. Israel strikes Beirut, expanding offensive in Lebanon. It was the first attack by Israel on the Lebanese capital in weeks and could complicate efforts by the United States and Iran to agree to a peace deal to end the war in Iran. By Ewan Ward. Israel widened its offensive in Lebanon on Thursday, striking Beirut for the first time in almost a month and pushing deeper into the country's south as its escalating conflict with Hezbollah threatens negotiations to end the U.S.-Israeli war in Iran. The Israeli military said it had carried out a strike in the Lebanese capital, but did not disclose the target. Lebanon's state-run news agency reported that the attack hit an apartment building on the outskirts of Beirut's southern suburbs, a densely populated area where Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed armed group, has long held sway. The strike has stoked fears that the city, which had largely been spared since the ceasefire in Lebanon took effect last month, could be drawn back into the fighting. Israel said on Thursday that it had also struck more than 135 targets belonging to Hezbollah over the previous 24 hours in southern and eastern Lebanon, including rocket launch sites and training camps. Many of the strikes took place in residential areas and affected civilians. One attack on a vehicle near the city of Sidon killed 6 people, including a mother and her 2 children, according to Lebanon's health ministry. Hezbollah also continued its attacks on Israeli troops in southern Lebanon, and sirens sounded repeatedly throughout the day in Israeli border communities, warning of incoming fire. The fighting appeared especially fierce around the southern Lebanese town of Zotar al-Sharikia, about 6 miles from the Israeli border. Israel said its ground forces have advanced beyond the forward defense line, an area extending several miles into Lebanon that Israel has occupied since it invaded the country in March. The widening offensive comes at a delicate moment in the region, with the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon only intensifying despite a ceasefire signed last month. The United States and Iran have been inching toward a possible agreement to end the war in Iran, but Iran has demanded that any deal include an end to Israel's strikes against Hezbollah. the most powerful ally in Tehran's network of regional armed groups. Israel's military offensive in Lebanon threatens to complicate that fragile diplomacy. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel said this week that the country's military was deepening its operation inside Lebanon, adding to uncertainty over whether the war with Hezbollah would be part of any overall U.S.-Iran deal. Iranian officials have previously told the New York Times that a peace agreement would end fighting on all fronts, including Lebanon. But Mr. Netanyahu has suggested that Israel would still be able to defend itself against threats from Hezbollah there, saying President Trump had affirmed that right. The Middle East is baffled by Trump's call to expand Abraham Accords. The president said more countries should be required to recognize Israel as part of a deal to end the war with Iran. Analysts say the chances of that happening are close to zero. By Vivian Nareem, Isabel Kirshner, and Elian Peltier. The social media post by President Trump made it sound straightforward. The United States would orchestrate a deal to end the war with Iran, and in exchange, a slew of countries across the Middle East and South Asia would join an agreement called the Abraham Accords, establishing relations with Israel. In fact, he said, that should be mandatory, but half of the countries he named, such as Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, already have relations with Israel. And the other half, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Pakistan, have no interest in establishing them anytime soon. As a result, the meandering ultimatum that Mr. Trump shared on Monday was met with a mix of silence and bemusement across the Middle East. Regional analysts said they were not even sure that they understood the rationale behind his proposal. Why would ending the war, which the United States and Israel initiated by bombing Iran on February 28th, provide an incentive to recognize Israel for countries like Qatar, which has lobbied desperately to prevent the war in the first place? It's just bizarre, said Yoel Gozansky, a senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University in Israel. What's the connection between a deal with Iran and that? I'm honestly puzzled. Two Western diplomats in the region said that no one was really taking the idea seriously. They spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss diplomacy. Asked to explain the connection between peace negotiations with Iran and expanding the Abraham Accords, a White House spokeswoman did not answer directly. Instead, she referred to remarks made by Mr. Trump on Wednesday, when he suggested that U.S. agreement on a deal with Iran could be made contingent upon countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar agreeing to recognize Israel. I think those countries owe it to us, he said. I'm not sure we should make the deal if they don't sign. The Saudi and Qatari governments did not respond to requests for comment. Under the Abraham Accords, a deal brokered by the first Trump administration in 2020, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco agreed to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. A wide range of American politicians have portrayed the pact as a major diplomatic achievement and have frequently referred to the accords as a peace deal. Scholars from the region say that is merely a turn of phrase, belying the fact that there has never been a war between Israel and Bahrain or the Emirates. In effect, the deals bypassed the central conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, declaring harmony between parties that were not fighting. Since then, the Abraham Accords have created opportunities for expanded trade, security cooperation, and tourism between the countries that signed them. The Emirates, the Arab architect of the Accords, has grown especially close to Israel. But the Accords did not usher in a new era of regional peace, far from it, and the Emirates' warm ties with Israel have increasingly made it an outlier in the Middle East. For Israel, the crowning of the Abraham Accords would be the normalization of diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, the largest Arab economy and home to Islam's holiest sites. Saudi Arabia does not formally recognize Israel, although successive U.S. administrations have made it their goal to change that. Few consider that a possibility now. Over the past couple of years, Saudi officials have consistently predicated ties with Israel on the creation of an independent state for Palestinians. Israel's current government, the most right-wing in the country's history, vehemently opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state and is unwilling to even talk of a pathway to one. Saudi Arabia will not be rushed into a historic decision that ignores Palestinian statehood, said Salman al-Ansari, a Saudi political analyst. Saudi Arabia's commitment to a two-state solution is not a slogan, it is not a bargaining chip. Mr. Trump's language implied that he was giving an order, not making a request. It should start with the immediate signing by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and everybody else should follow suit, he said. If they don't, they should not be part of this deal in that it shows bad intention. Perhaps even Iran, Israel's arch-enemy, could join the Abraham Accords, Mr. Trump mused. Wow, now that would be something special, he wrote. Soon after, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, who had recently slammed the potential deal with Iran, wrote his own post on social media calling it a simply brilliant idea to link the deal to the expansion of the Abraham Accords. I expect our Arab allies to embrace this, he wrote. If taken at face value, those statements would seem to indicate an ignorance of political dynamics in the Middle East, analysts said. An association with Israel, never popular among Arab populations, has become even more toxic for many governments in the Middle East as a result of the devastating wars that Israel has waged in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran since the deadly Hamas-led attack on Israel in October 2023. The more that American officials push for normalization as an imposition rather than as part of a mutually beneficial deal, the more unpalatable it becomes, said Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian, a Saudi scholar and senior non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum, a research organization. Under the Biden administration, the Saudi crown prince had been seeking substantial incentives from the United States in exchange for establishing ties with Israel, including access to American nuclear technology and a U.S.-Saudi defense pact. The extent to which Mr. Trump's mandate came across as a complete non sequitur in the Middle East made Mr. Al-Ghashian think that the Abraham Accords were possibly the only clear strategy the U.S. has in the region, he said. A deal with Iran appears shaky at best, and fighting has continued to flare as diplomats have negotiated the details. In Israel, Mr. Trump's linkage between that deal and an expansion of the Abraham Accords has been largely met by baffled silence. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has not reacted publicly to Mr. Trump's pronouncement. Analysts have said that the phased deal with Iran the president has proposed would most likely be hard for Mr. Netanyahu to swallow. If the bid to include an expansion of the Abraham Accords were meant as some kind of sweetener, the Israeli prime minister was not letting on. Asked about the Abraham Accords becoming part of any Iran deal, or if Mr. Netanyahu had discussed this issue with Mr. Trump, the Israeli government responded with a statement saying only that Israel is keen on expanding the circle of peace, which will be most beneficial to all signatories of the Abraham Accords. With Israeli elections expected this fall, and Mr. Netanyahu's political future on the line, the prospect of Saudi Arabia or other Muslim-majority states handing him such a prize appears even more remote. Those countries won't take a step before the elections in Israel and before seeing what the deal with Iran yields, Mr. Guzhansky said, adding, "We are still in such a fog of war." Mr. Trump even suggested that Pakistan, which has mediated between the United States and Iran to end the war, should join the accords. In Pakistan, one of the world's most populous Muslim-majority countries, officials and analysts greeted that call with a flat no. Pakistan does not recognize Israel, and its passports explicitly state that holders are barred from traveling there. Pakistan's defense minister, Khawaja Mohammad Asif, said on local television that joining the accords would clash with the country's fundamental ideologies. Mr. Trump's statement might have been an attempt to please parts of his domestic audience, such as Iran hawks who view the potential deal with the Iranians as a disappointment, Pakistani analysts said. They called the proposal a distraction from the peace negotiations between the United States and Iran. Trump may be trying to divert attention with his Abraham Accords statement, but it is a poor effort at that, said Malia Lodi, a former Pakistani ambassador to the United States and the United Nations. In the end, Mr. Trump appeared to give himself an off-ramp, raising questions about why he had made the proposal in the first place. It may be possible, he wrote in the Post, that some of the countries he named have acceptable reasons for not recognizing Israel, he said. But the rest of the countries, he said, should be ready to join in, making his settlement with Iran a far more historic event than it would otherwise be. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Cuba just lost its next best chance for fuel. A Russian tanker seemingly en route to Cuba with a lifeline of fuel has changed direction, a painful development for the island suffering under a U.S. oil blockade. By Jack Nikas. Cuba's desperate want for fuel seems to have just gotten longer. A Russian tanker that had appeared headed to Cuba with 242,000 barrels of badly needed diesel has turned away from the island and now appears to be on its way to South America. The diversion is a brutal development for the Cuban government and its people, who have been enduring a worsening energy crisis since the Trump administration imposed an effective oil blockade against the island in January. Russia has so far been the only nation allowed to break that blockade, with a March shipment of 730,000 barrels of crude oil. That oil, however, has largely already been used, and Cubans had hoped they were about to receive a new lifeline. But with the tanker's left turn, any more help will now most likely take weeks to arrive, if it ever does. Pentagon and U.S. Coast Guard spokespeople declined to comment, but expressed puzzlement at the tanker's new route. The Russian government did not respond to a request for comment. Ernesto Soberan Guzman, Cuba's ambassador to the United Nations, said that while he didn't have details on the Russian tanker, Cuba was counting on Russia to help it survive what he called an illegal U.S. blockade. It's hypocritical, cynical, that on one hand they talk about making efforts to open the Strait of Hormuz and so on, while on the other hand they are effectively imposing a naval blockade against Cuba, Mr. Soberan Guzman told the New York Times on Wednesday, referring to the U.S. government. A fuel blockade that in practice constitutes an act of war. The tanker's detour is a victory for the Trump administration, which has been trying to strangle Cuba into making major changes to its political and economic system. Cuba has said it has now depleted its fuel reserves and is surviving off domestic oil production, solar power, and small fuel shipments to private enterprises on the island. As a result, daily life is becoming increasingly difficult. Electricity works just a few hours a day. Cubans are cooking with charcoal and firewood. Aid distributed is complicated by a lack of gas, and fuel is essentially available only on the black market, where it can cost upward of $40 a gallon. Cubans are bracing for the summer heat, when demand for power generally increases, while the Trump administration is hoping the situation forces Cuban officials to accept U.S. demands. Secretary of State Marco Rubio denied that the United States was responsible for the crisis. The real reason you don't have electricity, fuel, or food is because those who control your country have plundered billions of dollars, but nothing has been used to help the people, he said in a video addressed to the Cuban people last week. Washington has been intensifying its pressure campaign. Last week, the Justice Department charged Raul Castro, Cuba's former president, with murder stemming from the 1996 downing of 2 civilian planes near Cuba that killed 3 American citizens. The U.S. government halted shipments of Venezuelan oil to Cuba after intervening militarily in the South American nation. President Trump then threatened tariffs on any nation sending fuel to Cuba, and in one case, the U.S. military escorted a tanker away from the island. Up until changing its route this week, the Russian tanker, called the Universal, showed numerous signs that it was headed to Cuba. On March 31st, the same day that the last Russian tanker arrived in Cuba, the Universal left Russia loaded with diesel, according to KPLR, a ship-tracking data firm. Its destination was left vague. Shortly after, Russian officials confirmed they were sending a second tanker to Cuba, "We won't abandon the Cubans," Russia's Energy Minister Sergei Civilov told reporters. The Universal passed through the English Channel on April 9th and continued straight toward Cuba until April 21st, when it suddenly stopped in the Atlantic Ocean, according to ship tracking data. The ship then drifted largely in place for a month until it abruptly headed south this week. Pausing in the middle of the ocean for so long is highly unusual. Fuel tankers operate on strict schedules to deliver their cargo, but it followed the same pattern as another recent ship carrying fuel for Cuba. The Seahorse, a tanker owned by a Chinese firm, spent weeks drifting in the Atlantic this year before it gave up and delivered its cargo elsewhere. The ship's owners had feared consequences from the U.S. government, the New York Times reported. The United States and the European Union have imposed sanctions against the Universal for its links to Sovcomflot, a Russian state-owned shipping company. Jorge Piñon, a University of Texas researcher who studies Cuban energy, said that the Universal's diesel would have been an enormous, albeit temporary, lift for Cuba. Trucks and tractors need the fuel, but Cuba can't produce it from its domestic oil. Mr. Piñon estimated that the ship's cargo, which was likely to be donated to Cuba, was worth $25 million. So now Russia is going to make a pretty hefty profit, he said. Australia sues 3M for $1.4 billion over Forever Chemicals. The lawsuit, the largest ever filed by the Australian government, claims 3M hid information about the harmful effects of PFAS used at military bases. By Katie Edmondson and Laura Chung. The Australian government said on Thursday that it was suing 3M for more than $1.4 billion in damages, alleging that the American industrial conglomerate had concealed information about the harmful effects of Forever Chemicals used at more than 24 military sites across the country. The lawsuit is the largest ever brought by the Australian government, Michelle Rowland, the country's Attorney General, told reporters in Canberra, the capital. This is a government that is prepared to take on one of the biggest multinational corporations in the world, Ms. Rowland said. The case is the largest in a wave of legal actions against the Minnesota-based company over contamination linked to PFAS, or per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. In 2024, 3M agreed to pay $10.3 billion over a decade to public water suppliers in the United States. State and local governments, including those in Minnesota, Alabama, and New Jersey, have also sued the company and received settlements. The so-called Forever Chemicals, which are called that because they do not break down naturally, have been linked to liver damage, developmental problems, reduced immune function, and cancer. They became ubiquitous, used in everything from clothing to the nonstick coating for frying pans to firefighting foam. That foam was widely used at military bases around the world, both to extinguish fuel fires and during emergency response training exercises. The U.S. Defense Department has identified 723 installations where PFAS may have been used or released, and Congress has since approved hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for cleanup efforts. In Australia, PFAS-containing firefighting foams were phased out in 2003 because of environmental concerns, though the Australian Defense Department did not begin its own phase-out until 2004. Before the government stopped using the foams, 28 military sites had been contaminated, according to the lawsuit. An earlier investigation by Australia's Defense Department found PFAS contamination was concentrated in areas where the firefighting foams had been used, stored, or disposed of. Since 2020, the department has paid out more than $366 million to settle class action lawsuits related to its use of the foam. Ms. Rowland said 3M had withheld environmental testing conducted by its own laboratory showing significant harmful environmental effects associated with the firefighting foam. She added that the company had said the foam could be safely disposed of and posed no significant adverse environmental effect. This misconduct has contributed to substantial costs for defense and the Australian taxpayer, including over $1 billion to date to investigate, remediate, and mitigate PFAS contamination, she said. Australia plans to use the $1.4 billion it is seeking in damages to help treat contaminated soil and water and provide alternative water supplies to communities near the military sites, said Peter Khalil, the Assistant Defense Minister. In a statement, 3M said it planned to fight the case in the legal system, noting that it never manufactured PFAS in Australia and that it stopped selling the product at issue in Australia around 20 years ago. Despite this, the Department of Defense continues to use PFAS-containing firefighting foams for nearly 2 decades longer, 3M said. In 2022, 3M said it would stop manufacturing PFAS by the end of 2025, while maintaining that the chemicals could be produced and used safely. At the time, the company said its annual net sales from PFAS-related products totaled about $1.3 billion. Concerns about PFAS contamination extend well beyond military sites. A New York Times investigation found that 3M scientists in the early 2000s had learned that the toxic chemicals, which the company's own research had linked to birth defects and cancer, were turning up in sewage that was later spread as fertilizer on farmland across the United States. In Minnesota, 3M disposed of its manufacturing waste at several sites in the eastern Twin Cities metropolitan area from the 1950s through the 1970s. Minnesota's Attorney General sued the company in 2010, alleging that its disposal practices contaminated drinking water, resulting in an $850 million settlement. 8 are rescued from Texas roller coasters stuck almost 100 feet off the ground. The riders waited for about 4 hours facing up on the roller coaster at the Pleasure Pier Park in Galveston. There were no injuries, the authorities said. By Francesca Regalado. A roller coaster with 8 people on board got stuck almost 100 feet off the ground in Galveston, Texas on Thursday, prompting an hours-long operation to bring the riders down. The Iron Shark roller coaster at the Galveston Island Historic Pleasure Pier malfunctioned close to the top of the structure, with its riders facing up. Live video on local news channels showed. The ride features a 100-foot vertical climb before dropping. The roller coaster stopped around 5 p.m., according to local media. Firefighters arrived at the park around 5:30 p.m. to rescue the riders, all of whom were college students, said Chief Mike Varela Jr. of the Galveston Fire Department. The last rider was brought down shortly after 9 p.m., he said. Local news stations showed firefighters working atop a tower truck's ladder as the sun set. Later, they were seen slowly lowering the riders one at a time. None of the riders were injured, though they were being checked for dehydration after being stuck in the sun for hours. Chief Varela said, "It was unclear why the ride malfunctioned," he added. Terry Turney, the chief operating officer of Pleasure Pier, said in a statement that the ride was designed to stop immediately in case it malfunctioned, as it did on Thursday. A thorough inspection of the ride will take place before it is placed back in service, he said. Pleasure Pier is one of Galveston Island's best-known tourist attractions. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, May 29th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.